Hello. Can you all hear me? Yes. If you cannot hear me at any point, please tell me and I'll just yell or something. So thank you for the introduction, Tricia. I won't repeat what she said. But as she said, I am writing a dissertation right now. This is my dissertation research. The research is incomplete, which means I'm in the middle of it. So I'm waist deep in notes, archival notes, and archival documents, which means that some of the things that I say today are not going to be the final conclusion. Some of these conclusions are tentative. I also have some questions remaining, which I'll address towards the end of the presentation. And if you feel the need to cite the things that I'm saying, please just go ahead and contact me and make sure that those are still the things that I think and can stand by. You see my email address down here at the bottom. If you need to contact me, please use that. As I proceed through this presentation, please save questions or comments, concerns, or criticisms for the end. And I'll try to keep the whole presentation under an hour, hopefully under 40 minutes. I'll go ahead and start a timer on my watch to remind me after 40 minutes have passed, so don't be distracted when that goes off. The title of my project is called The Bound Steppe. Today I'm going to present some notes about enslavement in Qing Mongolia. As these are notes, I've sacrificed a lot of detail for the sake of comprehensiveness. I thought that would be a better way to introduce you to the topic, some of the themes that I'm addressing, and where the study that I'm doing fits into the broader picture of the historiography of Eurasian studies, pastoral nomadic anthropology and history, as well as the study of the study of slavery in world history. So the reason that I began studying this is while I was reading about the history of pastoral nomadic in Eurasia generally and Mongolia in particular, I found ubiquitous references to enslavement, captivity, bondage, manumission, but I found that there were almost no monographic treatments of the subject and really just a handful of articles in a handful of languages that address the subject at all. And in fact, most of the time when the subject appears in general histories, the conclusion is that enslavement or slavery in Mongolia and pastoral nomadic societies was insignificant, rare, and primarily domestic. So that struck me as strange, considering the ubiquitous references to it, because enslavement and the related issues are fundamental to the way that we understand social history in other parts of the world. And so for my project, I wanted to try to bring some of those ideas about social history and the history of enslavement and servitude and unfreedom to bear on Mongolian studies and Mongolian history. So let's just clear the ground with a few terms that I use. Slavery. So for the purpose of this project, slavery means a social status which is maintained through a relationship, which is coerced, of exploitation, and it's premised on the exclusion of the enslaved person from full membership in a given community. That could mean citizenship, participation in religious rituals, exclusion from paying taxes, which might at first sound like a good thing, but maybe not if it also means a reduced amount of rights in other fields. Now, it doesn't mean all of those things at once. It is dependent and contextual on the community in which it is being practiced. The status is also distinguishable by members of the community from other forms of exploitation in that given community, meaning people in a community usually know it when they see it. And there's usually words to describe it. Banner is the basic administrative division of Qing Mongolia, roughly analogous to what we call a county in English. It's the unit around which taxes and obligations to the empire were organized, and also the channel of communication for people in their various smaller administrative districts to, for example, file appeals to higher levels of the legal apparatus. Banner community refers to the people who are registered in those banners. A testament is a will. A testator is the person who writes a will. So, part one, slavery skepticism. So slavery skepticism refers to the idea that, the scholarly idea that one cannot make the a priori assumption of the existence of slavery or enslavement and its related practices in a given community without positive evidence for the existence. For example, one would not be able to say, according to the slavery skeptic view, that there was slavery in Ireland during the period of the Roman Empire because there's not evidence of shackles or something like that. Now, there's various reasons that I argue that that doesn't make sense, and I was happy to find that in other fields this is also a problem. Timothy Taylor, who's a Roman archaeologist of Roman history and Scythian history, proposed that it makes more sense to move from that default position where slavery is not presumed to have been a social feature unless otherwise proven, to one where certain types of slavery are expected in most formations and should be excluded from consideration on the basis of positive evidence to the contrary. A good analogy for that might be something like singing. Most of the time we assume in any given community of humans that people sang, and if a person were to suggest that, for example, ancient Scythians had no song, they never sang, why not? There's no evidence. We would probably think that that is a counterintuitive argument. So in Inter-Asian, pastoral Inter-Asia, this type of skepticism happens at the intersection of Marxist ideas about slavery societies, in other words, the social evolutionary theory that slavery society precedes a feudal society, precedes a capitalist society, socialism, communism, etc. And that those types of societies shouldn't intermingle too much. A reluctance to carry out comparative studies with non-Eurasian pastoral societies. This is the idea that Inter-Asian nomadic pastoral societies are unique to the extent that they're incomparable with other types of societies. So for example, sedentary agriculture is simply too different. The methods and ideas that we bring to bear on those histories cannot be brought to bear in Inter-Asia. The assumption that large-scale or industrial slavery is real and domestic slavery is not. And this is a particularly dogged idea in the field of Inter-Asian studies and Mongolian studies. It's also usually gendered. Industrial slavery means the enslavement of men, usually, who are productive, for example, in agriculture, mining, or pastoralism, whereas domestic slavery is usually gendered female. In other words, the work that's carried on inside or around homes, such as milking, making cloth, etc. And the implication that the latter is unimportant, to me, aside from the theoretical problems, it also smacks of a type of sexism. Hand-wringing over terminology, meaning that many of the terms used for enslavement do not have a one-to-one correlation with terms that we use in English and other languages, and also do not have a one-to-one correlation with native terms of enslavement. We'll talk about that in a moment. And finally, the conflation of ethnographic observation with historical evidence. And that is what I'd like to talk. I'm going to give you an example of that now. So Herodotus was a Greek author who wrote a book called The Histories. In book 4 of that history, he describes the Scythians. The Scythians were active in the 8th to 3rd centuries BC, north of the Black Sea. One of the stories that Herodotus tells is that after the Scythians conquered the kingdom of Medes, in one city they blinded all the men and forced them to milk the livestock in a barn, at which point the Scythians left on a multi-year expedition. After they left, some years later, the blinded, enslaved milkers took over Medes, and they had union with their overseers, who were Scythian women left there to manage them. And from that union, made sons who grew up to be strong and had vision. So when the Scythians returned, these sons of the milk slave engaged them in armed combat successfully. The Scythians were surprised, didn't know what to do. They gathered, and one said, "The problem is that we've opposed them with weapons, and when they see us riding at them with arms, they believe that they are born of men as good as us. Instead, let us raise our whips." And the legend goes that they rode into combat holding only their horse whips, and the sons of Medes bowed down before them, trembling in fear, and so on and so on. The implication being that they recognized, they felt the stigma of slavery in their bones, and when they saw the masters of their fathers, trembled with fear. Okay, that's a semi-legendary tale at best by Herodotus. It has been interpreted in numerous ways by classicists and archaeologists. Surprisingly, the point of debate that is the most contentious of this story is as follows. As one classicist put it, Herodotus clearly never went to Scythia, or probably never even met a Scythian. If he had, he would have known the hospitality of a nomadic encampment and would never have said, for example, that Scythians would have had slaves. It simply didn't happen. Other scholars have repeated that, saying that there could not have been slavery, there was not slavery in the in Central Eurasian pastoral nomadic economies in general from the time of the Scythians onwards, because pastoral nomadic communities simply don't need slaves. And one of the primary authors of that theory is Anatoly Kazanov in English. And he is famous for writing about the anthropology of pastoral nomadism in English, but before his career in English, he produced a lot of archaeological works about Scythia. And it was in those books and a series of articles published in Russian and French during the 1960s and 70s that he argued that there was clearly no economic function of slavery in pastoral nomadic societies because the efficiency of pastoral nomadism was such that it required a very small labor force to herd animals, milk cows, etc. He backed that up with ethnographic research that he conducted in the 1960s in Kalmykia, where he witnessed for himself that the primary factor in the productive capacity of pastoral economies was the environment. In other words, drought, floods, snowstorms, etc. That is what mitigated production, not increases or decreases in labor. He took that idea and projected it backwards onto 2,000 years of history from Kalmykia to all pastoral nomadic Eurasia, published those theories in this book in English, ignoring the criticisms of Dumézil, who I'll skip for now for time. And then his ideas have been carried on by scholars such as Peter Golden, who argued that in an extremely erudite article about the terminology of slavery in Central Eurasia, concluded that despite the ubiquity of these references to slavery and the terminology of slavery, almost all of these people were females. And furthermore, slaves were few and exclusively of the domestic type, were irrelevant to state formation and social changes in Central Eurasia. In other words, it's not a topic worth studying. These ideas, interestingly enough, these are two of the main sources of Khazanov's. Vladimirtsov was a famous Mongolist in the early 20th century. He wrote a very famous book called The Social Structure of the Mongols, in which he remarked about enslavement that in the Qing period, that in the ranks of subordinates of the nobles, one can distinguish only two groups. One of them were the real slaves, Hyatet and Bol, and the other labored in the domestic sphere. And these are the people he said were called Gerin Hun, Bol Medal, Gerin Medal, etc. Vladimirtsov's methodology in that book is also worth mentioning because his goal was to combine ethnographic observations that he made in the early 20th century to the earliest Mongolian historical monuments, such as the Secret History of the Mongols and some of the 17th century chronicles. In other words, the methodology of retroactively applying 20th century ethnographic observation to texts and archaeological sites from between 800 and 2,000 years ago is a running theme in the slavery skeptic view of history. And Niebuhr is the theoretical basis of functionalism in economic functionalism in determining whether a society has enslaved people or not. It comes from one book that Niebuhr wrote called Slavery as an Industrial System, which is a book that we would call today armchair anthropology, meaning that he read several other people's accounts, combined the information that he found, and made lots of charts saying that whether or not whether a society has industrial slavery or not. His conclusion he made about Mongolia was that we do not have enough evidence from the Eurasian nomadic area to make any kind of determination about the actual existence of slavery. However, based on what we know about pastoral systems, among true pastoral tribes, slavery would have been of little moment, which again has been cited down to this very day. In the field of Qing history, scholars such as Tayama Shigeru and David Farquhar have also repeated these ideas, saying that although there was slavery in Qing Mongolia, it's very clear there's a status of people who have that name, and it's written about in the law codes. It was of no importance to our understanding of Qing Mongolia. So why does any of this matter? It's methodologically dubious. It reifies Western models of industrial slavery, which means it's effectively a Eurocentric way of thinking about societies. Slavery is unimportant unless it reaches some huge critical mass that we can measure in terms of GDP or GNP. After all, ancient Scythia probably didn't have people who called themselves economists, and they probably didn't think about production in terms of GDP. Slavery also is a taboo subject. It's embarrassing because it is monstrous. In today's world, there is no country in the world where it's not outlawed. However, at the same time, it is a universal feature of human societies. There's this kind of truism that every society, every human community at some point had slavery. There's a second version of that that says every human society at all times has slavery. Either way, it means that being skeptical of slavery in a given community or denying its existence in some way denies the social history of that place, at least in the larger picture of world history. So let's move on to some more specific things about our case. Terminology. As I said, in the slavery skeptic view of Eurasian pastoral nomadic history, there is quite a bit of hand-wringing over terminology. This is because words that are translated as slave from Mongolian and other languages, and any permutation, servant, degraded worker, etc., they do not seem to have one-to-one correspondences. So the sources that I've been using to carry out this research about Qing Mongolia are legal codes, legal cases such as criminal records, probate records, and literature, including religious literature, translated from Tibetan, and didactic literature, as well as the all-important dictionaries. Dictionaries produced usually commissioned by the Manchu court in Beijing, as translation dictionaries between Mongolian, Manchu, and Chinese, and sometimes other languages. This document, I'll talk about a little bit, not this specific document. This specific document is actually not about slavery, it's just about inheritance. But I am going to talk about it because the form that it takes, the literal piece of paper and the way that things are written on it, is very representative of the type of document that I've been reading to try to understand the subject. So this is a map of Qing Mongolia overlaid on a map of the current administrative divisions of Mongolia. The region that these documents that I've been looking at come from is primarily right here, this shaded yellow region. As you can see, it straddles Dunkov and Umungov. So a Gov province or banner at that time, primarily camel herding economy. It was also quite populous, and as you can see, it was one of the largest banners of Qing Mongolia. I read so far 354 testaments from that banner spanning the years 1738 to 1873, so a long century. I've also been reading, at this point, 322 testaments from the ecclesiastical estates of the Gypsum-Dambuchtucht, the Yikshev. And the geographical location of those documents is scattered throughout Mongolia. If you saw Anne-Sophie's presentation 2 weeks ago, she pointed out that the Yikshev was actually very resistant to mapping, and so I don't have a nice Yikshev map. But I've read now testaments from Oryanghai and Tornot and almost everywhere in between. They do tend to be based mostly in Hure. So this is what the document looks like, and I want to address this feature. This appears in quite a number of the documents, and I want to talk about it very briefly because it demonstrates the social function in real terms of these documents. You'll notice that it's a date, and you'll notice that the right half of the date is missing. In other words, there should be some bumps here, and there should be a line there for an L, and so on and so forth. The reason it's missing is because when the scribe wrote it, they made 2 copies. One copy is what you see. The other copy they placed over that copy, and they painted the date on the edge. Then they gave one copy to the person, the heir in this case, in the document, who then held it for safekeeping. That way, if somebody else tried to forge a document and said, well, those camels are actually mine, my dad gave me those camels, and so on and so forth, here I have a document to prove it, they could line up the date with that one and prove that no, in fact, it was a forgery. And many of the documents for manumission of enslaved people after their status is changed include this feature so that they could, if need be, demonstrate to the legal authorities of the banner that their status had in fact been changed, that no one could claim them as an enslaved person. These are the terms that commonly appear that I am referring to as enslaved people. The most common is Gerinhun, then Medl, then Khuvud. Khuvud in particular is a little bit different. The contemporary word Khuvud means sons. The classical Mongolian word for sons was Kubugud, not Khuvud. So that's actually a special term of the art in Qing documents. Bol, Zart, Skarinarat, and Hyatet, and Shibikchin. Here's an example of a document that I translated. I translated this document not because it is especially interesting. It's not. The especially interesting cases are usually much longer, and I don't have too much time. But this one has 3 of the words that I want to talk about because I think they illuminate some of the difficulties and interesting aspects of this project. So in this document, Ashok, who's a banner member, is releasing his slaves, his Geren Hubut. There is an address to the banner officials and some tag and so on. Then he says, as to these 3 people, my sons, Damba, Jamson, and Konchek, who were born of a Hyatet Huken, who belonged to my uncle, Danchen George. This of meant that this Hyatet Huken belonged. I'm taking 3 camels and 30 sheep and letting them use their own livestock for the sake of performing duties, at which point their bones will be whitening their bones. I hereby release them into the Sum. The Sum is a sub-administrative district of a banner. And after I die, my other sons may quarrel about who has claim over these people, and therefore I'm offering this note of guarantee to prevent relatives from quarreling over these three sons of the Hjatthuchen of his uncle Denzendorch. So I want to talk first about Hjatted. And the reason is because the word, I've been asked many times, especially by my American colleagues, about the ethnicity of slavery in Mongolia. In other words, were the Mongolians enslaving Chinese people? Were they enslaving Russians? Were they all enslaved by the Manchus, or what was going on? And the word Hjatted is interesting because it seems like it might imply that the ethnicity of enslaved people was maybe predominantly Chinese, but it was not. So one of my colleagues pointed out that Alton Khan's code of the 16th century uses the word Chinese in cases in the context of servitude. Here it's Ja. The code was written in Tibetan, not in Mongolian, but the word Ja is unambiguous. It means China. It also means India, interestingly. And the reason it's a little bit tricky in Alton Khan's code is that Alton Khan's realm did have a number of Chinese workers. Exactly what the status of those workers was is not clear. We do know from historical records that they transmitted smallpox to the Mongolian population. And so it's possible in some cases like this one, a new Chinese under 1 year is not counted as a thief, to imagine that this is just referring to ethnic Chinese people. However, in the third one, if someone secretly kills a Chinese, it doesn't make much sense unless we realize that Ja or Hjattet was in fact just a general word for servitude or slavery. Later, the Halkjurum, which people have argued was created on the basis of the previous law code, uses the language Hjattetin Hjattetet Berchugi, so taken and given as a Chinese of a Chinese to the banner, which of course makes no sense and is unambiguously means the slave of a slave, and that's recognized by scholars today. The book, for example, edited by Jalan Ajav, points out that, of course, Hjatted simply meant to enslave. Now, interestingly, in the later law codes that were commissioned by Beijing, the word Hjattet as an indication of servitude or slavery is completely expunged. I have not yet read an imperially commissioned work that uses Hjatted in that context, including the dictionaries. There is no Qing era dictionary where Hjatted means anything but Chinese or Chinese script. Instead, they translate words like the Chinese nu or jianu, which should mean house slave, as getting bald, which is, and bald is a more recognized general term for servitude in Mongolian. I'm going to skip this slide. This is references, this is the use of bald in the Subashit, but I don't think we need to go into that right now. So in going back to these Qing era dictionaries, this is the only Qing era dictionary that actually does have the word Hjattet as a secondary meaning, slave. The reason why this dictionary uniquely has this recording is that it was written by a Polish man, Kowalewski, who traveled through Mongolia, and on the basis of his travels in Mongolia and in Beijing, the texts that he read and also the Mongolians that he spoke with, he composed this dictionary. Vladimirtsov also used the word, if you'll remember. So what this tells me is that in the late 19th century, despite the fact that the word Hjattet appears in no imperially commissioned or for Beijing eyes documents, it was still understood in society to mean enslavement. In other words, if a Polish explorer asked someone, what does Hjattet mean? Probably someone could explain to him exactly what it meant. They might say, but don't go around saying that in Beijing. It might ruffle some feathers. That was also, and Mark Elliott has actually pointed out something similar in his book, The Manchu Way, that Manchus held, especially in the early Qing, a number of Chinese slaves, and that it was something of a sensitive topic to Chinese officials, who were always a bit wary of the fact that Manchu bannermen were allowed to extract from the subject population of Chinese people their own servants. And so I believe it became a taboo term. I also believe that it had nothing really to do with the ethnicity Chinese. In this way, I believe that it is, and the law codes bear this out, that it simply meant slave or to enslave as a verb. And it's pretty similar in that way to the English word slave, which was also originally an ethnonym referring to Slav and Slavic, but of course, I don't even know by what year, but certainly by the 17th century, the term slave in English did not have ethnic connotations. It simply meant a person in servile status, of a very particular type of servile status. Next, the whitening of the bones. So this is a set phrase that appears in a lot of documents and also as white subjects and white shav or white disciples in even more documents. It's interesting as a verb because it suggests a process from having, I guess, less white bones to having more white bones, something like that, or perhaps dark bones to white bones, which tells us something about the transitory nature of manumission. In the first place, that the act of status change did change something about the person's body, at least at the conceptual level, which means that the stigma of enslavement was also carried through the body, which we know that it was because enslavement of, for example, Gerinhun status and metal status and all these other statuses was hereditary. So the sons and daughters of people who had that status also carried that status unless they had their bones whitened. And it tells us also something interesting about Mongolian folklore in general. There's a received wisdom in Mongol folklore that the nobility had white bones and that the commoners had black bones. I don't know how many books I've read this in. I have not yet found a reference, however, to white bones amongst the nobility in any Mongolian language source contemporary to these documents. In other words, I have not found a reference to the white-boned nobility before, let's say, 1920, which strikes me as odd. I don't think that white bones actually had much to do with the nobility, just based on reading documents where there are this many people who are very far from nobility. In fact, they're on the lowest class of membership in a community at that time was albit or chav, depending on which community. And if those are the people who are white, or if whitening someone who was not of the community conferred upon them the status of albit or chav, then we can decisively say that white bones did not confer nobility onto people. It still leaves open the question of why the masses, the artumen of Qing Mongolia, were called harts. And that's a very ancient word that people have connected to the color har, black. But again, I'm not sure. Outside of philological speculation, there's not much evidence that it has anything to do with the color of people's bones. So the last word, gerinhubud. I call these domestic terms, kinship or domestic terms describing relationships of enslavement. These are ubiquitous across the world, from China to ancient Rome, where the word for enslavement was familus, which is where we get the English word family, down to 1800 South Carolina, where enslaved people were called boy or son, mammy, and so on. And those words were used, we know, in the United States to avoid taboo words, such as slave, which was a word made more popular by anti-slavery abolitionists and activists than by pro-slavery people. who tended to liken slavery to a type of adoptive family and used the white supremacist rhetoric of paternalism to justify the system. So the words that we see in Mongolia, gerin hun, gerin medal, gerin hubu, gerin bol, these are the instances of them. They are the most common way to refer to these people. So why am I so insistent at this point on calling them enslaved people, you might ask? They seem, because they fit all the criteria that we need. Purchasing of gerin hun, one of the origins of gerin hun into the community was via purchase. Now, of course, purchasing a person, a monetary transaction involving a person, does not, in the Qing Mongolian context, necessarily indicate enslavement. After all, when people got married, there was a monetary transaction involved, bringing a woman into the man's house. Furthermore, when people were adopted, money was transacted. In fact, to this very day, in most societies, if you officially adopt someone, you have to pay for the service. But repeated transactions do indicate a transference of a different type of status or relationship, one that is more akin to ownership, that we could correlate to the ownership of property or something like that. Had to be released by owner. In all of the documents that I've read, the authorization to release or to manumit these people and all the other terms that appear for these people is conferred by the testator, not the zasak, not the darak. No, none of the leaders in the banner of the Mongolian government, none of them released the slave through their power. They authorized their subject to release someone. The distinction, I think, is actually pretty important because it means that the authority over the person's body, over their bones, if you want to think of it that way, belonged to the testator. Punishment status, so people who were made bald became, the words were transferable with gerin hun, etc. Other scholars have pointed this out, particularly Professor Futaki had pointed this out in a footnote in one of his articles. And he said that it was a little bit problematic. I'm not sure why it's problematic. I think that it's actually quite normal to find this kind of ambiguous use of kinship and kinship-like terminology in relationships of enslavement. And actually, the trend of terminology in the Mongolian archival documents fit almost exactly a larger world historical pattern of enslavement and manumission. Furthermore, the formalistic study of terminology, where we should assume a one-to-one translation between these terms, it's not a useful way to think about these documents, and it's also unnecessary. Scholars have pointed this out, scholars such as Bodden and Henry Serois long ago pointed this out in the study of Mongolian noble titles. For example, the exact same offices in the government in Ordos, Chakhr, and Mongolia all had different terminology. Sometimes the terminology was off by one step, but referring to the same office, and there were also honorary titles, which mean that formalistic studies of titles, whether it be nobility or enslaved people, servants, etc., in Mongolia is actually holding, in my opinion, studies back. So, part 3, the decline and the afterlife of slavery. So those terms that I just talked about is one way that slavery is referenced in the testamentary evidence of Qing Mongolia. However, there are also many documents where it's very hard to find words that actually any of these status titles, if you want to call them that. Instead, people say, I bought someone, I purchased someone, or even I just took someone, and now I'm going to release them. I chose this document as an example because it almost does that. So the first half, the So this fellow is purchasing Sedendorj, who was given to Sonam to repay a camel to replace the sheep that he stole. So then Danzan bought Sedendorj, again, for the price of one camel, so an even exchange in that case. So that's two exchanges, one related to the punishment for which Sedendorj was a proxy, and then repurchased by someone claiming to be his relative. However, we have no idea what his relational status was. It's not specified in the document. He simply claims he is my close relative. And then he worked very hard for him all his life, whatever that means. So there's no reference to words like slavery, getting hun, getting kumun medal, etc. We have to infer what happened from the story itself. We know that because it involved a penalty, that the person was, I would say, according to Qing law, a bal, probably called a gerin hun in real life. And then after I die, because my relatives might try to enslave Sedendorj, so I'm going to find him a woman, marry him, have a household, some livestock, and release him to the Noyan, who's also named Sedendorj, which is, sorry, I wrote the name wrong here. Anyways, the unique part of this one is that he actually said, try to enslave him. In most of these documents, if you'll remember this document that we were looking at, this is the usual stock phrase that people use. They consider and they're afraid that their own sons or relatives may quarrel about who has claim over these people or this person. And that expression avoids, again, all use of any kind of enslavement terminology or servile terminology. And there's many documents that combine those features. So they do not use any of the terminology here, and they do not use any of the terminology in describing why they bothered to make the testament in the first place, which means we have to, read between the lines, basically. Now, that also leads to a particular problem in interpreting the documents, especially in the middle of the period that I'm looking at from about 1810 to 1830. It's what I have come to call in my mind a permanent blur, where it's really hard to tell what's going on. It's hard to tell what's going on in terms of the people's status as getting hun or not, or adoption. And the reason is because the terms used in that period become more and more vague, more and more avoidance of the terms associated with enslavement, which leads to this question of the declining numbers. So the great scholar Ish Natsugdorj in 1965 wrote a very short but very good article about the declining number of getting hun in registers in Mongolia. He points out that I think that his dates are 1747 to 1855. The registered number of getting hun in two banners in Mongolia declined. They declined absolutely, and they declined relative to the population increase in those banners over that almost 100 years, to the point of true, I would say, approaching true, irrelevancy, like 0.001% of the banner or something like that. But he was unable at that time to answer the question about why it happened. And so that's why the permanent blur that I just referred to, this is where I think the permanent blur becomes important, because I believe that the answer might be somewhere in there. And that will lead us to the afterlife of slavery. So beginning in the 1800s, discourse of community integration, also called adoption, begins shifting away from statuses of enslavement to notions of illegitimacy and relatedness. And I'm going to argue that this shift was part of a juridical strategy to preserve inheritance. So Professor Oyun Jarval of the National University of Mongolia has written several erudite articles about legislation related to getting Hun and statuses of servility in Qing Mongolia. Based on her work and my own archival research, this is a very rough and ready timeline. There's a lot more going on in here, but I see these as some of the key moments in legislation regarding that affected a decline in the number of enslaved people. In 1772, there was a prohibition on interbanner human trafficking. 1776, that was extended to post roads, relay stations, garrisons, in a sort of, as far as I can tell, Mongolia-wide sweep, asking people to do their due diligence in making sure that there were no Gerin Hun stationed at relay stations doing official imperial duties. Many were discovered, or most of them were actually women, and most of them had lots and lots of children who were called illegitimate butach. 1805, the prohibition on nobility arbitrarily claiming retainers. That was based on a case that happened in Inner Mongolia, in which a horse veterinarian was working in the Mongol 8 banners as a very talented and skilled veterinarian. Someone got jealous, said that he was in fact a slave from another banner and shouldn't be taking an imperial salary. That got the attention of Beijing. They did an investigation and discovered that he was a Khamjalik, but no one in Beijing knew what a Khamjalik was. So they asked, is he a bannerman? Is he a enslaved person? Is he a house slave? What's going on? They found out that he was a Khamjalik and thought that that didn't make much sense, so they said that from now on, nobility in Mongolia cannot arbitrarily claim registered people as their own personal servants. I'm sorry, I didn't explain the word Khamjalik. It is like a retainer or a personal servant. 1811, 1815, imperial orders for nobility to distinguish between the status of enslaved people and retainers. That doesn't sound very important, but it affected one of the large changes, and this has to do with the fiscal environment of Qing Mongolia. Related to increasing monetization and the developing labor market in 19th century Mongolia. So Devin Deer has illustrated that the tea trade from China to Russia during the 19th century increased the availability of fungible goods in Mongolia, which served as money, tea, silver, and other objects. And that brought wage earning opportunities. Devin Deer particularly focused on portering, meaning carrying things, conveying goods, including tea, from one place to another, as one of these wage earning opportunities, and that labor in particular was organized through monastic networks. There were also, however, wage earning opportunities at the relay stations or post roads and garrisons, which is exactly where in 1776, if you will remember, there were inspections to remove Gerin Hun. Now, when they were removed, it's not that the people who were supposed to go to the relay stations started going. Instead, they began hiring people to go and paying them some pittance. It's not clear how much, probably in tea. We know this both from observations. Pozniev talks about it in his travelogue, and also the national hero of Mongolia, Sukhbatr. In his youth, he worked at a garrison on the Russian border. And worked, he did. He earned a wage, and you can read about it in his biography. Women's labor was also monetized, so I found a set of documents about the wives of personal retainers in Setsenkanamik, who their duty was to go to the palace of the queen of the banner, where they were ayakch. Ayakch is from the word ayak, bowl, so they were the bowlers, which I think meant that they filled up people's tea bowls and probably helped them put on their hats and so on. And they were able to pay, I believe it was 200 pieces of tea to other women who could replace them. I'm going to skip this for the sake of time. So the afterlife of slavery, I argue that beginning in the 1800s, there is a noticeable shift in testamentary evidence away from the status management of slavery. So the discourse of slavery almost disappears. and is replaced by a discourse of illegitimacy and adoption. The word in particular that I'm looking at is butach. Now that word is a little bit nasty in modern Mongolian, I think. It is followed a similar trajectory as the English word bastard, but butach is not gendered the way that bastard is. I prefer to use the term illegitimate. And unchin, which is the preferred word in modern Mongolian, which means orphan, is actually used completely randomly. It has, in my mind, it has very little legislative meaning, whereas butach actually becomes the discourse around which legitimacy in Banner community membership is discussed. And it's not just for people who who were probably something like getting hun or bol or medal. It's also for people who claim to be Taj. So the nobility also had to wrestle with the concept of illegitimacy beginning around 1830. Right, and that's connected to this blood relatedness of adoptees. There's a parallel periodization, which I found recently reading a work by Walter Heisek. And in it, he argues that the creation of genealogies at the lower levels of the nobility wasn't practiced until about the 1830s, at which point lower level Taj began writing genealogies that connected them to the larger networks of the Mongolian nobility. I don't know what the connection is yet. If anybody can help me find sources that would connect these disparate ideas, I promise I'll buy you a beer. Also, during this time and before, the Qing court in Beijing was persistent in their efforts to make Mongolians take care of one another. This particularly happened in times of environmental catastrophe, or zut, in which the Beijing court, signed off by the emperor, would remind the Mongolian officials and the nobility that they were obligated by their own customary laws to adopt and take care of poor children from other banners and take them into the family. In other words, Beijing used the discourse of adoption and nobility to encourage these kinds of changes. And I'm running out of time. I'm going to skip Pozniev and go straight to the so what questions. So all this seems to offer the end of slavery, the decline, and the afterlife of slavery offers a unique vantage point for thinking about enslavement and manumission in the Qing Empire more broadly. Consider that some of the same factors that I discussed, particularly poverty and a harsh fiscal environment, were also true in the Chinese parts of the Qing Empire. But something like the opposite happened there. Instances of selling children and pawning children and wives increased during the 19th century during these times, where in Mongolia, I'm arguing they decreased, or they appear to decrease. So let's talk about the big pictures. There is a persistent narrative of Mongolian social stagnation during the period of Manchu rule. Foreign observers like Pozniev, Vladimirtsov, and so on in the late 19th and early 20th century were witnesses to the tail end of a social transformation in Mongolian society. However, as I argued with Vladimirtsov and then later Khazanov, they didn't see it that way. Rather, they tried to use their observations of the end of this period to reflect all of Mongolian history and all of pastoral nomadic society. So I think that one of the tasks of Mongolian studies today should be describing and explaining those social transformations. In other words, we simply need to historicize Mongolian society. Unfreedom itself is a universal feature of human society. Whether or not you agree with the terms that I've chosen to use in this presentation, the types of social changes that I'm talking about are, I believe, undeniable, and I think that explaining them will bring some lessons and wisdom from the history of Mongolian society to the stage of world and human history, which probably everyone in this room agrees is a net good. So thank you for listening. I welcome your feedback. Again, there's my email.